To the first session, and we're starting a little late now this session, but I'll ask the speakers to try to keep to the speaking time that we have allotted. And I won't reintroduce at this point our subject of today. I'll simply say that I'm very happy to be here. And these are not simply words of circumstance. I'm really happy to be here on what is also a very important day. And it's an important day for people like me who have been educated, formed by the foundation, and everything that the declaration that we are speaking about today has helped to plant as seeds and to bring to life. And it's very important to see how authentic and constant over time and how faithful to themselves the fruits of this work have been. So my best wishes to all those who have worked so hard and are celebrating this important day. And I've been asked to chair this session, the afternoon session, and the subject is peoples as the subject of rights, people's entitlement to rights. And that's important for us to have a clear understanding of the subject of the new agenda that we can work with the Algiers Charter in our hands. The peoples as the subject, the peoples as a transversal subject. We'll find that, we'll hear that and understand better how that word is used, listening to our speakers this afternoon. And I'm also delighted to be able to chair this session because it is going to be the session in which we start traveling. We go to the different countries and see how this agenda is actually taking shape and how the things that we have spoken about more theoretical or historical terms this morning are actually being experienced in everyday life. They're the battles that are being fought in the countries and the situations that we will be talking about this afternoon. So I promise to take up very little time, and I will straight away welcome our first speaker of this afternoon's panel discussion. And our first speaker is Javier Giraldo Moreno, who is a Jesuit priest. He's comes from Colombia. He works there at the Centro for Research and People's Education, the CINEP of Bogota. He's a deeply committed man. And it will be very interesting for him to take us to his country, to Colombia. The peace process in Colombia that was hosted by Havana has already been discussed this morning, but it's a very complex country, and so I'd like to invite Javier Giraldo to take the floor. More or less 20 minutes for each speaker is the time that we have envisaged, and Father Giraldo Moreno has the floor. My fraternal greetings to you all. I have been asked to speak about impunity, transitional justice, and rights seen from the grassroots. Now, I'd like to speak more concretely about the exercise of transitional peace, which is currently being implemented in the peace process in Colombia. But I have to say a few introductory words. We saw the video on Lelio Basso, and it referred to the date, July the 4th. This date being, of course, the independence of the United States, when the first Declaration of Independence was signed, July the 4th, and the rights of the people were declared. And in choosing this date, Lelio Basso was also claiming and denouncing the way the United States, as a country, as a state, had turned against the rights that had been proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. And when the Nuremberg Tribunal convicted war criminals and persons responsible for wars against humanity and genocide, the same countries that were part of the tribunal of Nuremberg also turned against these same principles and were the greatest perpetrators of violence against these principles and have committed these crimes of genocide, of crimes against humanity, war crimes. The Declaration of Algiers, which was based on the experience of the Bertrand Russell tribunals, is an attempt to respond to the crisis of justice in the world, a world rife with genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, where the vast majority were protected by state or parastate impunity, and the most basic rights, such as the right to life, the right to the most basic freedoms, were jeopardized, and the constant and massive violation of these rights was a radical non-recognition, a rejection of the rights of peoples. The Cold War was the context in which this impunity as a policy for state crimes became consolidated, and where a punitive justice that was biased against people's justice occurred, and this is where we saw the social revolution. Anti-communist ideology, which developed in the Western world, was the theoretical foundation of the barbaric acts that affected the populations of the Third World. In Latin America was full of military and civilian dictatorships with uniform parameters that obeyed instructions coming from Washington and competed in barbarity with Hitler's practices that the United States itself had condemned in Nuremberg. And I cannot but recognize the nefarious role that the Church played in these situations, providing incentives to these ideologies, with a set of pontifical encyclicals between 1878 and 1949, which radically focused on condemning communism, socialism, liberalism, and the Church was the very best ally of the brutal repression against workers' movements, people's movements, based on the ideological underpinnings of the national security-inspired regimes. The struggle of the grassroots movements, the people's movements from the 60s up until the end of the 20th century, claimed the criminal code of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which defined international crimes very concisely and established basic criteria for criminal responsibility, universal jurisdiction, and time barring of justice. Impunity, nonetheless, was the hallmark and the major incentive of state criminality over decades. The principles of Nuremberg were dead letter, as Max Weber taught. The break between ethics and law made headway in the world and in the cultural spheres of value that predominated in modern times, money and power, subjected law to their own internal logic. In this period, recognizing the law, reconnecting law with ethics, became very important, and the basis of this was the General Assembly of the United Nations, which very slowly, in a very difficult, winding path, elaborated these principles and suggested complementary approaches and called for the application of principles, which usually were simply on paper. But between 1989 and 1991, we saw in 12 countries of Latin America a session of the tribunal that was held in a very special way, with national hearings that focused on the victims and on the local contexts. This was a trial that ended in a final deliberative session that was held in Bogota in April 1991, and revealed this general panorama of impunity for the crimes of lèse humanité, crimes against humanity in the entire region. There were repercussions very rapidly in different parts of the United Nations, and an expert, Louis Joinet, who was also a member of the tribunal, was asked to draft a body of principles against impunity, a document that today is internationally recognized. And it was updated in 2005. This document called for the truth commissions that had already been adopted in countries such as Argentina, El Salvador, and Chile. But despite the political transformations of these regimes of national security and the decisions adopted by regional and international tribunals against the laws of impunity that strove to protect the perpetrators. Despite all this, nonetheless, impunity continues to be an unresolved issue, and in most of the countries that are affected by the consequences of the global market and the neoliberal ideologies, the brutal repression against social movements is based on generalized, well-protected practices which in many different ways protect the crimes of state by offering impunity. The victims, with their struggles in the last few decades, have achieved the definition and recognition of their most basic rights, the rights to truth, to justice, to repairs, indemnities, and the guarantee of non-repetition. Already in the 90s, there were many of these truth commissions, more than 40 of these, and they dealt with many of the issues relating to revealing the truth. And there were many different examples of repairs and indemnities, raising many questions. But perhaps the most difficult issue today is that of justice, which is tightly linked in with the guarantees of non-repetition of the criminal acts. And to face the issues raised by justice in societies that are striving to put an end to a war or an internal conflict or a repressive regime based on barbarity, the concept of transitional justice has been supported, and that seeks to articulate, to combine justice with peace, bearing in mind that there are trade-offs that both require sacrifices. Colombia, in the last few years, has experienced the search for peace accords between the governments and the guerrilla forces of the FARC after 60 years of armed conflict, which left millions of victims and led to the incremental degradation linked to war in its many different aspects. And this process has gradually revealed the mazes, often the dead-end roads, that need to be negotiated in the quest for peace accords. Our country already experienced 33 years of failed peace processes in the last cycle of violence, without even enumerating the negotiations, the agreements, the elimination of of combatants of previous cycles who had supported the same causes. Long-standing tradition has shown that the agreements are not enforced, and the rebels are eliminated after demobbing. But not only the rebels themselves, but also the social and political forces that are close to them. A few days ago, a document was signed in Havana, in Cuba, which defined in the second to last of the 6 points of the agreed agenda the beginning of dialogue, including an agreement on a bilateral ceasefire, which is supposed to be definitive. Nonetheless, the country is deeply polarized with the growth of political positions of the far right, and we seem to see the same positions of the Cold War compounded by the monstrous economic powers of multinational powers that are fiercely defending their rights with all powerful means. It is not easy to welcome, to accept the euphoria based on the text, the formalities, the rituals of this positive language on peace, while silencing the many questions that reflective and analytical people have facing the real implementation of the peace process. And I would like now to list some of the fears and some of the many open questions that are related to the actual implementation of the peace accord. And first of all, there is a dual language. At the first level of language, it is said that the process was not a surrender of the delinquent rebels, but rather recognition of the fact that the war did have social roots, and that the two parties in the war, the two poles, did commit crimes. Then there's the other language, the one that is not used around the negotiation table, which instead uses words and is based on the approach that speaks of surrender, of defeat, of being subject to legality and to a supposedly democratic power structure. So while in the formal negotiations around the negotiating table, the roots of the conflict were discussed, relating to land in particular and democracy, the negative response to anything relating to the economic and political model prevailed, and all of the proposals relating to these roots were considered as exceptions or reflections of those issues that could not be discussed and agreed on. Interminable discussions finally led the rebels to accept the symmetry of treatment of the combatants on both sides, and not recognizing the much greater seriousness of the crimes committed by the state and the characteristics of the political crime and the right to rebellion. They also had to accept the immunity of the former presidents, immunity to justice, and the non-recognition of the responsibilities of leadership, both principles which, however, are enshrined in the Rome Statute, and the avoidance of which strengthens and expands this inveterate impunity. The terminology used by the state and the establishment through their powerful mass media describe the post-conflict period as one of reintegration or reinsertion of the combatants in a supposedly legitimate and democratic society that they had wrongly, mistakenly condemned and taken arms against. It affirms that all social reform from now on must be achieved through being subject to the existing system, seeking votes through the electoral system, therefore, ignoring the extreme corruption of the electoral apparatus, which has been dominated for decades by the huge economic powers and the owners of the mass media, which dominate people's awareness and conscience by obfuscating truth. Then the development of dialogue led to perplexity and wonder in the most aware layers of society, seeing how the state simply denied the obstacles for peace, considering them to be non-existent and the realities of the past as having been overcome. Paramilitarism, the military doctrine of the internal enemy and national security, and criminalization of all forms of social protest were taken for granted. And no one can understand that there has been no announcing of a reduction of the armed forces, but quite the opposite, an increase in the armed forces, a remodernization of the armed forces, despite so much praise of the end of the war. There's also a great mistrust in many sectors on the subject of transitional justice. This special jurisdiction drawn up by a group of high-level legal experts based on the basic criteria of transitional justice contains two principles that can deny the already weak expectations of justice: the principles of privatization and the focus on those having the highest level of responsibility. There are applications already underway of these principles, facing the concrete examples of genocide that showed that a corrupt utilization of these two principles is the privileged mechanism of impunity. And finally, in general, the motivations for deterrence that have been used to encourage the peace agreements to a large extent rest on the practical impossibility to bring about change through armed conflict, owing to the overwhelming, monstrous power of state armed forces supported by imperial power with the greatest destructive reach of recent history. There's a total lack of any ethical consideration of the suffering and cries of pain that led to the insurgency, the armed insurgency of combatants against the state. The predominant political discourse is pragmatic, egoistic, indifferent to the real possibilities of justice. The president's speeches have insisted on peace that will benefit business and transnational investment, while violently repressing social protests linked to the ecological and social destruction that have caused and continue to be caused by these investments. It is true that the extreme right, the far right, condemns the trial and this process because it promotes impunity of the rebels that have been responsible for many war crimes. But from the side of the people's movements, there's a greater fear of the impunity of the powerful and the state's agents and the paramilitary, whose war crimes against humanity and genocide far exceed the crimes of the insurgents, and their impunity returns to support the continuity of a repressive power that affects the least protected sectors of society and violently blocks any form of social reform that is called for with such urgency. This practical description of a practice of transitional justice reveals once again the fragilities of law, especially when it is approached from these two different cultural value spheres that monopolize modern culture: money and power. Commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Algiers Declaration, François Rigaud, then president of the Tribunal of the Foundation, raised the issue of the legitimacy of power and affirmed that legal science had yet to give satisfactory answers, including in the area of international law. And he said then that bias by legal theory that identifies law with the state, the science of law, has frequently had a hard time justifying the juridical quality of a non-territorial order owing to a lack of public power and obligatory jurisdiction, with the exception of some very significant issues such as condemning colonial domination, foreign occupation, or the apartheid regime. International legal order, with those few exceptions, has not been successful in limiting or controlling the legitimacy of state powers, and that including in the area which should be its own, that is peace and war, and the weak continue to be non-protected and subject to the dominion of the rich. He added, the meaning of norms and law cannot be sought in its background. The will that is attributed to the author of the law, its meaning is discovered progressively and is written more in its future than in its past. And I think that the creativity, the experiences of transitional justice have revealed the intimate relationship between law and politics, demystifying, demythologizing the supposed independence and impartiality of legal structures. And this is very evident in those hegemonic regimes, excluding others, where power is de facto exercised by the powerful and violent minorities, and where paramilitary violence protects the legal decisions that affect those who are powerful. And this was experienced by Colombia for many decades. And despite the formal efforts to build a state based on the rule of law since the Constitution in 1991, real power continues to be exercised by a powerful minority based on transnational interests, which leads to a schizophrenic state which is formally based on legality, but in reality it's based on thousands of clandestine networks of parastatal violence, the relationship of which with the state is clearly denied by the functionaries of the regime and the mass media. The first recent experience of transitional justice was under the far-right government of President Uribe in 2005, with the Law 975, which was paradoxically called the Law of Justice and Peace. After negotiations with the most well-known paramilitary leaders, he obtained their subjection to a system with an indulgent justice in which the maximum sentence was between 5 to 8 years, and so the most atrocious forms of crime were committed by many thousands, 32,000 paramilitary persons were the authors of 42,000 atrocious crimes, but only 22 were sentenced, and they were all in liberty in 2015. Uribe added to this legalized paramilitarism, linking millions of persons to war tasks through networks of informers and people cooperating and remodeling the statutes of private security companies to link them to war-related tasks, such as being auxiliaries of the official armed forces. Illegal paramilitary returned to its actions with the same objectives: persecution of any social or protest movement, with clearly inspired instructions against any form of insurgency, inspired by anti-communism and fascism, the unconditional support of government and the armed forces, supported by transnational companies, the ecological description of which is defined as progress, and the financial support of the most powerful networks of drug traffickers. The government has new acronyms now for these forms of common delinquency, not relating to the state, and they are articulated and coordinated with great canny approaches to paramilitary legal and illegal links protected by a language that denies their existence. So there's no doubt that the experience of transitional justice was inspired by this approach with the negotiations also with the FARC. And that is especially obvious in the maximum sentences, the maximum being set at 8 years. There's been a lot of debate on the negotiations with the FARC. They started in 2012 with the presence of the governments of Norway and Cuba as guarantors and Venezuela and Chile as supporting countries. The most difficult point was linked to justice facing the rights of the victims. A new experience of transitional justice, which is today more explicitly supported by sectors of the judiciary and academics. From the very beginning, the FARC stated that they would never subject themselves to Colombian justice because it is extremely corrupt, and in view also of its responsibility in the monstrous impunity of the state and its most atrocious crimes, and the impunity of the paramilitary and their shameless partiality and dependency on the regime, concepts that it shares with much of the population, which consider Colombian justice to be ethically collapsed. There are many different formulas were sought to seek impartiality, including the creation of a regional criminal court supported by the more progressive governments of Latin America. And while the insurgents seek judicial structures that would be more independent, the state's agents were tormented by the evaluation of what had happened in countries that did adopt more bold laws on the impunity of the military and party officials, laws that were later invalidated by international tribunals. Former President Cesar Gaviria issued a public charter asking for the measures of impunity to be fully protected, to ensure that they would not be disallowed in the future by international tribunals or by the national courts itself. There's much debate, a lot of frustration and threats of the negotiations falling through, and that preceded what was finally known as the special jurisdiction for peace. It cannot be denied that this formula for justice was original, and there were some successes in articulating the opposing interests of the insurgency in the state, owing to the fact that in both there was fear of subjecting justice to the polls, and based on the basic recognition of the fact that both sides had committed atrocities. I've already pointed out the fragility and the concessions that have weakened universal justice, and the pitfalls that have been well camouflaged, but that do exist in the language of these accords. One of the positive parts was that ordinary domestic law is excluded from this jurisdiction. It obeys the legislation that to a large extent violates the human rights of the majority and subjects them to the most inveterate practices to protect the impunity and privileges of the most powerful. This jurisdiction will apply only, according to the agreement, to international law of human rights, international humanitarian law, and the International Criminal Court. It does and accepts the explicit violations of some of the articles of the Rome Statute. The agreement also includes some mechanisms of protection for the future for the international and national laws. However, these protections are fragile, and an in-depth analysis reveals the dependency of the law on politics and on the whims of the powers that be. A lot of criticism has been heard on the more general effects of the negotiation, reconciliation, and transitional justice processes in South Africa, in the former Yugoslavia, and in El Salvador, in Guatemala, North Ireland, and in other countries. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, in its final report, recognized that its strategy of truth for amnesty, seeking the repentance of some of the perpetrators, had failed because only 1.7% of the 7,127 requests for amnesty had been granted. The vast majority of these requests have been put forward by common criminals who are trying to take advantage of the situation. And in a number of supposedly reconciled or pacified countries, through processes of transitional justice, violent episodes occurred which led to more extensive and even more brutal violence than that which had been experienced during the wartime. The explanation for this is that the negotiations do not deal with the true roots of the conflict, and the governments that benefit and implement these fragile pacifications then give themselves over totally to the interests of the global markets and are co-opted by the principles that inspire these global markets, the sacralization of the profit-making of the more powerful businesses and their neoliberal strategies that allow the markets to ignore the basic needs of the vast majority and monstrously destroy nature. And this is the greatest risk also that looms over the peace euphoria that currently exists in Colombia. The Declaration of Algiers was based on a very sober analysis of the imperialism that is inspired by the struggles of thousands of movements for liberation. It emphasized the self-determination of peoples, the rights to land, to natural resources. It conceived of inclusive, solidarity-inspired economic models and sought reparation for those who suffered because of the powers that tried to enrich themselves at their cost. The Permanent People's Tribunals documented with great detail genocide, destructions of peoples and ethnic groups in great proportions, pointing out very precisely who the perpetrators were and calling for the respect of international law, which it, to a large extent, coded. Today, the foundation and the tribunal have major challenges to face. The structures of the United Nations do not represent the peoples, they represent the states. And this, while following the dynamics and the interests of the transnational powers and capitals, a judicial body that was meant to meet the universal calls for universal justice that resounded over decades. The International Criminal Court has been co-opted also by the same world powers, and today deals only with cases that arise in Africa. Most of these are requested by the governments of Africa themselves against their opponents, leaving aside the tragic situations that are calling for universal justice, such as Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Sri Lanka, and many others. And as Flavia Natanzia explained so well, looking at all of the pitfalls, the difficulties that exist in developing the statutes of the Rome Statutes. The concept of peace and reconciliation, which includes the experience of transitional justice, does not appear to embrace that close linkage between justice and peace to deal with the roots of the conflicts and seek the way forward. The law that is built by the People's Permanent Tribunals, as stated so lucidly 30 years ago by François Rigaud, is a right more of the future than of the past. Thank you.
Thank Father Javier Giraldo Moreno. I'm sorry, we've gone beyond the 20-minute speaking time, so I'll try to recommend speakers to stick to the speaking time so that we might have some time at the end of the session for questions from the floor, so that we can sort of have a conversation with the participants. Now, what has been told about the exercise of transitional justice, and he has painted sort of a very important history, which is that of the history of Colombia. Well, the next speaker is a doctor, medical doctor, Carlos Martin Beristain from the Pedro Arrupe Institute of Bilbao. So we're going to deal with other issues in other countries with him. He's going to share with us other experiences in Latin America. So I'd like to ask him to take the floor and stick to the speaking time. Thank you. I'd like to thank you all, and I will speak in Spanish. I'd like to thank Gianni and the organizers of this conference for their kind invitation and for the opportunity of sharing with you the work I've been carrying out with victims of human rights, and also a reflection about memory, which is a tool, a very powerful tool for the resistance of the peoples. In the midst of the war in Guatemala in '94, we started out a project for the reconstruction of historic memory in Guatemala. It's a project which was designed to give a saying to the victims of aggressions. We had 5,000 testimonies from the Maya population of violence that had been perpetrated against them. And this is extremely important because this is more or less what we have been doing about sort of reconstructing memories, and how can we sort of deal with a kind of fear that has been spreading about memories. Well, it's important when we hear about these testimonies, the witness that we talk to tell us, well, please believe what I'm telling you. And it's important because they're given an opportunity of having recognition for what they have gone through, because they told us that they had experienced something which was horrible, and they were treated and abused tremendously, and there was violence, almost criminal violence, dealing with children and women and men that were sort of treated like animals. So we wanted to, in this exercise, we wanted to give visibility to what happened in our country. And it's also important to consider what has been done by the People's Tribunal for Latin America. I did participate at the last session of a tribunal which was held in Mexico. So, and memory can represent a very powerful tool. It's not just something which will cover facts that has happened in Guatemala. We were discussing about peace, and sort of an agreement had been signed about the end of the war. But the military were very scared about this form of words, a committee for truth, and they didn't want to use this type of definition. So they gave a different definition. They called it the Committee on the Clarification of Facts that had occurred in the past. There is something else which was also extremely important, which characterized our own project as opposed to other sort of projects that we had been working on, was the following, where we said the guerrilla fighters and the government will sign up to a peace agreement, but what's going to happen when it comes to the impact of all that on our communities? One thing is to sign a peace agreement, but how are we going to deal with the suffering and the impact of all that on the people that belong to our own communities? And this is also part of the whole sort of process whereby memory can help us reconstruct the society, because the fact that had occurred had created great suffering. So we also dealt with other conflicts which had occurred. We have been working with indigenous communities in the Amazon, in Ecuadorian Amazon, to deal with the pollution caused by oil drills and mining in the Amazon. We could document what happened to the communities. We could came across evidence of displacement, forced displacement, violence against women. We set up a workshop which was attended by 50 women that wanted to give evidence of this pollution that had affected them. But this was also an opportunity for women that to give evidence of what had happened to them, the people that were suffering from all sorts of diseases, that died of cancer. So, and we have also the same experience with what we have been doing on human rights to the so-called social environmental conflicts. We have to consider such conflicts along the lines of other conflicts. So we have to try and sort of convert into legal notions something which is not as yet enshrined in the law. So we had to translate the notion of the impact of such pollution into other sort of concepts which could be addressed by the Inter-American Tribunal. So how can we see to it that legal concepts could sort of come closer to a reality which is inherent to the life of the people? So we have to have concepts which are close to the life experience of the peoples. So we have to sort of reflect on how we use law. Well, we have to consider when will the sort of memory be started. 3 years ago, we started working in Western Sahara, trying to give evidence of violations of human rights, and we discovered sort of a witness, a 14-year-old boy. When the Algiers Declaration in '76 was being discussed, that boy was witnessed the massacre of several sort of his people. So eventually he survived the massacre because a Moroccan soldier protected him. 38 years later, we went back to a place which is 400 kilometers in the Sahara Desert, 1 kilometer away from the wall built by the Moroccan people. So this, when we got there, this man who had not gone back to that place, when we got there, he said, well, this is the place. And we found two things there. We found a grave with 8 Bedouins who had been executed. And he had sort of been witnessing what happened when 2 people were shot dead before him. And they were killed and shot when they asked where the Polisario front was, and the answer from these people was that they didn't know where they were, and they were shot dead. And by the same token, we could sort of consider the possibility of investigating what happened to the 400 Sahrawi that disappeared. So this is the sort of problem that we are grapple with when you start sort of when we started investigating this example. Well, this 14-year boy decided he will never forget what he had witnessed, and so we were able to sort of take advantage of his evidence, so we could sort of eventually sort of have sort of a ruling against those that were responsible for such acts. So this is disobedience with respect to the sort of orders given that you forget what you have seen. The same goes for what happened during Operation Orion. Was an operation carried out in a township in Medellin, and the paramilitary forced the local population not to pick up the bodies of those who had been killed, and it was sort of a policy of terror. There were many women who decided they would not obey the orders, and they challenged this. So, and then there were some nuns, the Lauritas nuns, that at some point developed a family tree with all the dead, as if this was a family tree of just one family, the people that had been sort of killed in that community. On the other hand, if you look at the war in Guatemala, during the war in Guatemala, there were so-called model township where the local population was being sort of re-educated. The population that were belonging to the guerrilla factions. In these model townships, and there was one in particular, the Akamal township. Well, people told us what the experience was to live there. They were exposed to constant sort of lessons of re-education by the military, and they would. They were being told all the time, don't think about the soldiers, don't think about the massacre, as if they could impose on these people to forget what they had witnessed, to do away with their collective identity. A number of years ago, in a conversation with Dario Fo in Madrid, I was saying one of the accomplishments of power was that of converting history into a cabinet full of dust that no one would care about. We tried to prove that it's important to reconstruct one's own history. Well, I was personally involved in the history of Colombia, but many of such stories are told when basically they could not be told. But during the Uribe government, during the war based on terror, we started working with a network of women in Colombia, and we were able to collect testimonies of many women because women felt confident and they could talk about with other women, and so we organized these testimonies quietly. So we were able to sort of put together such testimonies, and we wrote a report which was entitled "The Truth of Women." And this is extremely important because when reference was being made about a future commission on the truth for Colombia, we could make use of such testimonies of women. This would be helpful for the future of Colombia. And this had a very major impact with respect to the fact that people do not seem to be affected by the suffering of people. So it's as if people that have suffered have no visibility. So we try also the extrajudicial executions were being converted into something else to deny what had, or into what has actually happened. And that is how they want to make sure that the impact of violence and aggression has no visibility. In Mexico, those who have disappeared are called differently to try and ensure that we do not understand what is happening. On many occasions, memories are memories which are useful to express our pain, our suffering, not just to denounce something. This is the kind of work we've been doing on women. After this presentation of the report, we have had several such presentations in Colombia, in a region of Colombia which is called Cauca, and we were in a meeting with women that had participated into this event of the presentation of the report. And some of them said, well, I was back home with the book, with the report, and I told to my children, see what happened. And that was her own history. After they read the book, her children told her, Mother, that happened in Colombia. That happened to many women in Colombia. But the mother had not had the opportunity to share his experience with her family, so that clearly had something which had a tremendous impact to make sure that this suffering and pain would serve a purpose. That is how we work with memories during conflicts and also memories which can defy powerlessness. There was a workshop which was organized in '97 in Colombia. We were working with leaders of grassroots communities that were trying to retain a sort of space for civil society in the midst of war. How can you retain the social fabric in the midst of war? So there were these grassroots communities promoting peace in Colombia. So we were sharing the experience that we had working with Guatemala refugees in Mexico, or our work with communities of resistant township in areas which were isolated in Guatemala. One of the leaders of such communities, which was later killed, Luis Eduardo, told us this has been extremely important that we could share our experience with other communities and what we have experienced in Guatemala and Salvador. Sometimes people feel that we are insane, that this is something that is impossible. How can you fight against this? You should resist what is happening during the war. So this idea of resistance, it's important, and it's also an example of how you bring together two cases where you feel powerless, you feel stronger because you can take into account the reality. So we manage to join forces and resist. If people identify with fellow men and women that have been resisting, they will help us reconstruct the memory with others. If I speak of my own people, the Basque people, we had some experience with the victims of the guerrilla, the ETA, and victims of the police. These are the mirror images of victims. So it's two memories which mirror history, which is very clear. And you should not be speaking to the other party. Well, we have been working for 5 years with victims from different parties. And at the end, we were able to sort of realize that we were all sort of sharing the same suffering. We were able to establish a dialogue, and we were able to agree on a number of issues. But society and the politicians do not manage to achieve this result. But that's an extremely important accomplishment in our struggle against impunity. I'd like to say, by way of conclusion, that in many more places in Colombia, in other countries, we see that there's this powerlessness. Well, in Mexico, I've been working in a commission of the Inter-American Committee on the investigation of 43 students that disappeared in Mexico. So, well, this is something which we have sort of also come across on other occasions during the sessions of the tribunal. So impunity generates this sense of powerlessness, that you can't do anything to take matters into your hand, that there is no alternative scenario to that. And I think that a lesson we have learned from our experience is that we can sort of accomplish something. These are very important challenges to all of us. I'd like to conclude with an example from the Maya's culture. Well, it's a two-way street, your experience. You learn something and you teach something. So the tribunal has its own sort of two-way process. You build history, you sort of hand down ruling, and you see how you can strengthen the communities that have been sort of such abuses. So the only hope that we have is to strengthen the social fabric of society, and that's the focus of our work of reconstructing memory.
I would like to thank Carlos Beristain, especially for respecting the amount of time that he had available, and for telling us and explaining with us all these examples, and for having talked about various fields. I, for example, wrote some words down that I really liked from his speech. Maybe we could go back and talk about it even more. We talked about different wars that are being fought. And this is what we're going to talk about right now. This morning I was listening to the quotation by Kissinger, who said it is easy to foster regional conflicts, and the guest who was here said we count 1,500 conflicts nowadays. So the geography of conflicts, of current conflicts, is very big, and the result of this, of all these conflicts, is in fact mainly what we started talking about at the beginning of this session, the fact that there is a transversal population. That is what we're going to talk about now, and the guest I'm just about to introduce, I believe, will talk about things that are in our everyday life, things I talk about every day. For example, Europe, and which are the challenges which Europe is facing nowadays. So I would like to give the floor to Fulvio Vassallo, Paleologo from the University of Palermo, and he is an activist of an association which links jurists who deal with juridical studies on migration, and to which I also turn to in order to understand what we could say on asylum rights, on migrants. What could we say on the existence of this transversal population? Where can they go? this morning someone was talking about formalizing the right of not rescuing someone to population and not only to a single human being. So I must say I'm expecting a lot from this next speaker. So I would give the floor to Fulvio Vassallo, Paleologo, and once again, please stay in your 20 minutes. Thank you for inviting me. I will try respecting the 20 minutes that I have. And the issue that I'm going to talk about probably would require an entire session, so it will be quite hard, but I will do my best. First of all, we can certainly, as we said this morning, talk about peoples, migrants, if those who build up peoples are the systematic violations, the people that belong to all these populations and what they suffer. So it is a very vast population. We're not only talking about migrants who come from the southern part of the world or from third countries compared to the European Union. We're also talking about migrants who come from the European Union. Maybe in a few weeks even our children will be part of these migrants, or maybe in a few months. The countries that will start following the example of Great Britain, if this were to happen, we know what might happen in the future. So I would like to talk about migrants under a general point of view, not only referring to migrants coming from outside of the European Union and to the negative meaning that we usually give to this word. We're talking about peoples who do not have a political representation, peoples who at times it seems as if the less we talk about them, the better it is, because we all know that as far as migration is concerned, in many countries of the world, the decisions are made and the regional systems are put into practice. For example, we can see what just happened with Brexit in Great Britain. So we're talking about peoples who do not have legal representation, because every time there is a violation, for example, let's just think about those who come by sea. Let's think about the many examples that we experience or that we experienced in 2012. That was just a combination that allowed some lawyers to have the right to go appeal to the Court of Strasbourg in 2009, and therefore in 2012 obtain the condemnation of Italy due to whatever occurred in Libya. So at the end of my speech, we will ask ourselves something that is very important as far as the Permanent People's Tribunal, which is that to identify, even outside of legal issues, the possibility of sanctions for the abuses that people, such as men, women, children, who belong to these peoples, are victims of every day. And also to identify some possibilities to intervene directly, because we cannot just wait that others give them justice. We need to, in some ways, try to give them back the protagonism and dignity that they require. And this would also mean giving dignity and protagonism back to ourselves in order to defend fundamental rights, starting from the understanding of the fundamental rights of human beings, the right to life, the right to personal freedom, the right to health, all rights which are not given to many people, also due to international organizations. For example, I'm thinking of the United Nations and of the role that many organizations have as far as migration is concerned, and the role that they are obtaining as recognition to the United Nations from many countries. I'm thinking about Europe with the many migration compacts and with the various processes of Khartoum, which are externalizing the border control to delegate to third countries the control of irregular migration. But I would also like to talk about the Mediterranean area, because those who spoke before me gave a general idea of other parts of the world. And the Mediterranean area has this weird destiny in this moment. We could say it is an area which is losing centrality. It is losing economic power both in the north and in the south. Let's just think about the economic crisis which are affecting Greece, Italy, or Spain, and which are very strong and felt in countries such as Egypt, such as Tunisia, or Libya. Maybe it would be better not to talk about Libya under this point of view, because the situation of conflict is making the population making them live in a situation of precarity. And maybe in a few months we could see people fleeing from Libya and coming to Europe. So we see that there is a Mediterranean area which is becoming more and more poor, but at the same time it is acquiring more centrality as far as migration is concerned, and unfortunately also as far as victims. Because only this year we have already had almost 3,000 dead people in the Mediterranean area, and this is the same number as the previous year. And for sure these people are coming to Europe through the Mediterranean from Greece, Turkey, and other parts, and they are going through very dangerous paths. In no other places in the world there is such a high number of dead people, of people who have not been found anymore. And the number of people who die and are not found is way higher than those who actually reach Europe. So this modality in the Mediterranean area is related to people's mobilization, people who are always considered to be inferior, both in the countries in which they have to transit in order to reach the final destinations, and also in the countries in Europe where they arrive. So, for example, in the welcoming centers, which cause marginalization, other than the richness of those few who are able to manage the situation thanks to political power. And therefore, they do not give migrants what we consider as being the minimum systems as far as the minimum international standards are concerned. And another thing that we notice is that Europe is turning to the Atlantic for economic interest. For example, Brexit is one of the examples that I could give you. And we are setting aside the Mediterranean. This means that we're only leaving to Greece and Italy the burden of facing the situation. This situation wouldn't be so hard to face if it were dealt by the whole Europe. So only Italy and Greece are dealing with the situation, and they are welcoming people. The Schengen borders have been closed, and this is the final issue. So the real problem is impede and not allow migrants coming to Greece and Italy so that they will not be able to reach Austria or Great Britain anymore. This is the real problem nowadays, and it is quite clear in the various proceedings and provisions of Europe who are trying to face the issue of what they call illegal migration. All the most important provisions deal with illegal migration. Between rescuing people and illegal migration, there is for sure a terrible burden on countries. I will give you an example, a very concrete and current example. Yesterday in Tripoli, there was our Subsecretary Amendola, who was visiting the country, in order to come up with an agreement to deal with more effectiveness situations for facing illegal migration. Our agents in the previous years have tried to deal with this with Libyan forces. And we all know that there were people who were victims of abuses. And in these days, there are some training courses in various European countries in order to train Libyan people to help them face these situations of people who are trying to reach our country. or Europe in general. As of yesterday, from Libyan news, we found that 97 illegal migrants were arrested, among which 32 coming from Eritrea. And Libyan journalists confirm that they have already talked to Eritrean forces in order to send the 32 Eritreans back home. We all know what can happen to someone coming from Eritrea if he or she is sent back to his or her country. And at the same time, we should all know that during the process of Khartoum, Sudan is acquiring a more important role. And this is having terrible consequences, especially in the case of people belonging to the Copta Church who have been refugees in Khartoum and in these days are being taken back to Ethiopia or Eritrea. So if the fight to illegal migration leads to all of this, we should understand, we should try to think it over and understand which could be a different approach to reach criminal organizations which need to be fought without causing these terrible effects on the life of people and of those who belong to migrants. I would like to give you another example as well. On the path, for example, in Sicily, we just had some brilliant police operations where we were able to dismantle trafficking of people who were dealing with human trafficking, but Nigerian women who were at times also minors, and they had fled from welcoming centers. They had stayed in these centers and they had been taken to places to either be sent back to Nigeria or they were put back on the road. And one of these minors had escaped from these centers. This is something that I can tell you from my own experience, thanks to relations that I have with my association or with others such as Borderline in Sicily or an Italy-German association which is present in Sicily, and I'm able to verify all of this. I would like to apologize for speaking too fast. So periodically we go visit these centers and we are able to see that the contrast to illegal migration ends in these centers when there is some type of confusion. Because even though people are, we ask people to give us we take fingerprints of people, we often see that their young women already have cell phones and therefore they are able to get back in contact with traffickers. So despite our trying to solve this situation, it is not always very easy. And one of the centers that we're trying to promote for this is Villa Sicaria in Sicily. So unfortunately, we are working together with the great decisions which are taken in Brussels, but international organizations, among which we also need to put the UNHRC, as far as the Geneva Convention is concerned, for the access to the territory, because in many cases we deny people who have already been recognized as having this right in Sudan. So they travel from Sudan, but we deny them access to Italy, because in Libya they do not have the possibility of proving their asylum request. And as far as humanitarian channels are concerned, people from the Italian government have expressed their lack of appreciation for what is occurring. for example, during the last event of emergency. So, for example, the lack of humanitarian corridors. And we know that this is something that can be done. Relocation is something that has stopped in the south of Europe, and many people who initially had the possibility to get back with their family are still waiting for the putting into practice of their right. And maybe they were moved from Sicily to Rome. We're talking about hundreds of people who have been blocked for months now, and we are not at all talking about their transferring, which is something that the European Union had agreed to the previous year with the European agenda on migration from Jordania and Lebanon to the various European countries. But all of these European countries actually took back their availability. So in reality, we are experiencing a new phase with respect to the previous years, in which the relation with third countries was a bilateral relation. Nowadays, the European Union is starting to talk with the origin countries of migrants, proposing an exchange. And if we go back in time, we could compare this to the Italian-Libyan agreement, a bilateral agreement which dates back to 2008, which already agreed to economic advantages, also with premises, even military premises, to oversee Libyan territories. However, the real model nowadays is the agreement between the European Union and Turkey. This is an agreement which has been brought before the European Court of Justice, and we are very sad to say that the request for transferring in Turkey presented to the European Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg by 3 migrants who were in the island of Chios were actually rejected by the Court of Strasbourg, which did not find any reasons to actually apply these, maybe considering Turkey a secure country. But unfortunately, we see that as far as European governments are concerned, regardless of their political orientation, on these exchange policies and externalization of border controls, which are even becoming international cooperation policies, there is a unanimous agreement. And even at an international level, I do not see real political experts who want to go against what is going on right now. Maybe even here this morning we talked about a few issues which are controversial, which go against this delegation to third countries to control migration. But in fact, when in the parliament there are Italian missions abroad, which also comprehend this type of intervention, in the past we have seen that, for example, with the agreements with Libya, this is something that happened, and it might happen again when there will be new agreements with Libya, which is to say that the majority is a bipartisan majority, and there is not a lot of space for those who try to defend human rights for migrants. So what I'm trying to say is that in the natural torture between legal obligations and human rights obligations, I feel as if we are mainly fighting illegal migration. And without considering only a few brilliant operations, we see that there are many victims, and women are not the only victims. They're not the only sexual victims. We're also talking about workers or minors who are often victims of prostitution themselves. Just think that if we go outside any center, any station in big cities, we see that there are many migrants who suffer and are not safeguarded. So I will conclude now, and I hope that you might have a few questions. I really think that we should not be too naive on the possibilities of intervention to actually guarantee the human rights for migrants on behalf of the great international agencies. I think that we need to work for advocacy, for legal protection, for cultural and language mediation. In many centers, very often there are no cultural mediators. We should open negotiations for rights at local level, territorial level. This is something very hard, but it is the only way and it is the only thing left to do. Because unfortunately, once again, I want to say, under a political point of view, the scenario that we see from our country and from Europe as a whole is a scenario which does not give a positive outcome for the request for human rights which migrants are asking for. And lastly, we hope that the migration compact which Italy proposed to the European Union can go beyond the building of European borders and a new formulation of the asylum requests, which should make mandatory human rights for those who are asking for political asylum. And we need to make sure that this is actually implemented in Europe, because the risk, if this is not done, is that Schengen borders will close, and this will represent a stallment for migrants who reach Italy. And this could lead to an explosion of the Italian welcoming system and also to civil crisis both in Italy and in Greece. Another thing that we could, if you wish to find out more about my intervention, is something that is said on the website of the association, Diritti e Frontiere, Rights and Borders. And of course, if you have any questions, I will answer. And I hope that you focus on what we need to do concretely, because the scenario that we're facing is quite clear in its development. And we know and we see what is the object of research. And this is something that we're dealing with even in university with the various investigation groups. There are many English researchers who are dealing with this despite the fact that Brexit won. And what I'm talking about is the issue of external border control, which goes beyond the prejudice of rights of people who need to transit through these borders, and the guarantee of free movement in the Schengen area. And this is the recognition of the fundamental rights for foreigners, for migrants, both those coming outside of Europe and those within Europe, who are always looking for and keep moving around our countries. Thank you.
To Fulvio Vassallo, Paleologo. He was referring to some sort of sanctions that should be sort of considered. We were talking about a vacuum of legislation where we should refer to the lack of sort of a political approach. He mentioned the unfortunate agreement with Turkey. And I think that the tribunal could wage usefully a fight against this agreement, because that is a clear new way of violating rights, failing to comply with the rights. At this stage, we're going to have a short coffee break, 15 minutes at the most, and we'll reconvene soon. We'll talk about women. We'll go to the far end of the world. We'll go to India with Mary John. Okay, we'll break for 15 minutes.
Introduce our next speaker. As we already said this morning, we're talking about, in this session, about conflict involving people in many different spheres, many different areas, leading to different sorts of repercussions, and we're ranging widely. We talked about the environment this morning, consumption, the famous TTIP. Now we're going to move to another area, which is perhaps more classical in our way of approaching rights. And we will be talking about the rights of women, women's rights in the economy, with the defense of women's rights, what can be done for that. And our first speaker will be Mary John. She will be talking about gender rights. Mary John works in the Centre for Women's Development Studies. And over coffee, she was telling us about the situation in India, which is a very complex country, a very complex situation, and she'll help us understand her work. Also, by telling us some stories, some cases that will help us have more insight on her work in India. So you have the floor.
Good evening, and once again I would like all the other speakers. I would like to thank the organizers. Am I clear? Can you hear me? For this invitation. It's the first time I am a part of a process like this, and I want to say how welcome I have been made to feel by Gianni and everyone else who has made this event possible. I know it's the end of a very long day, so I empathize with all of you who are brave enough to still be here at this late hour. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but I don't see any sign of it. So a quick question, can the PowerPoint be put up or not? I'll start, okay. So the title is a little different from the title in the program. It's a little long, but it's trying to convey something of what I want to talk about. It's called Globalization, Financialization, and Gendered Rights, the rise of microcredit, and the struggle over a living wage. So it's a bit of a mouthful, bear with me. And I thought, given what we've been hearing all morning and into the afternoon, just to sort of set a little bit of a context before I get into the examples that I want to try and compare and contrast from the Indian case. I don't want to get into too much detail because there's no end then to the detail. So I'm going to try and hold back on that kind of detail and nonetheless hope to build something that could be in conversation with all that we have heard today. And of course, the reference point is the Algiers Declaration. That time, and so my first slide, if it had been ready, was called Then and Now. And then was obviously the time of decolonization, the time of talking about peoples and self-determination, a time when economic nationalism was a basic principle that was very broadly held as progressive. And I say this because we live in this time of tragic irony where economic nationalism today has been comprehensively appropriated by the far right. Not just the right, but the far right. What we've seen in Brexit is indeed that kind of appropriation. So I'm marking the then and now with an example of economic nationalism. Today is also a time when we've seen rights discourses proliferate beyond measure, and I think in general that is a really good thing to see, and I think we've heard so many examples of that in the course of the day. So from the time of the Algiers Declaration to the time of the present, that rights discourse has all but become hegemonic, to the point that even alternate paradigms don't find. I mean, there are alternate ways of thinking about justice outside of a rights paradigm, and we hear very little of those. So it's a complex, ambivalent moment, one marked by this kind of proliferation. My next slide would have been Globalization and the Many Faces and Phases. It's coming?
Maybe
okay.
You should go there and...
Can I? Oh, here it is.
Here.
All right, I can see it right.
You can operate it from the computer.
Oh, then I can operate it myself.
Sorry, I think
that's the best.
One position you need to... It's from here. We had not understood that. Okay.
I see, those are not understood. Okay. I thought I had asked for that. Okay, so this was the title. I can jump that one. This was the then and now. You heard me say those. Is this on? Okay. So I've covered those points. This is where I was, which is trying, and I'm going to keep doing this very telegraphically, trying to give you a feel of things. And since my talk is going to be primarily around the economic, bear with me in terms of giving you these very, very like telegraphic points in terms of the picture from a country like India. And India is this very strange space. I won't get into the details of it, but you keep hearing that it's the largest democracy in the world, and we've been hearing about spaces that are so anti-democratic. So here we are, this largest democracy. What could probably be wrong in a space like ours? But if you look at the pattern of globalization in India, you get some idea like what could be going wrong, because we have this powerful yet disastrous combination of very high rates of growth. For us, it usually is two decimal point pick. We've had 9, 10, 11% rates of growth. Now they say it's going to be 8, 7.5. That's considered low. I'm sure all of you are gasping that this is considered low. But it's a disastrous combination of high growth rates with practically no real employment generation. In other words, losses of jobs more than compensate for new jobs. And the phrase that Indian economists use very often is jobless growth. In terms of the broad scenario of the economy, we are still hugely dependent on agriculture, 70%. I think it's unheard of in the rest of the world. But it's stagnating. It's not generating either GNP or jobs. We have a small growth in services, and we have shocking declines in manufacturing. And in contrast to that I'm giving you, as I said, this terribly telegraphic kind of background. We have rights discourses, which are parts of campaigns, bottom-up campaigns, right to food, right to education. Believe it or not, the right to education was only put into some kind of legal framework about 4 years ago. This is the peculiarity of a country like ours. Right to livelihood, all of these proliferating rights, but translated, and this is one of the big points I want to make, it's not directly connected to women or gender. It's something that I think third world spaces, especially a country like ours, is extremely capable of doing, which is with this proliferation of rights discourses, it is translated into a welfare category. It is translated into a policy of schemes. It is never ever translated into a set of universal rights. So this is the game that is going on with nations like ours, that we have a proliferation of welfare schemes which are governmental and anti-poverty alleviation schemes. So rights become anti-poverty schemes. Right? A right to livelihood, a right to education, right to food. Right to food becomes a nutrition program in the slums or in the rural areas. Right? Not in my view, what a universal right ought to look like. In terms of gender now, and again, this is being very, very quick. The first point, and I make this because I sometimes feel we, sitting in the third world, have also reason to talk back to the first world. And one of my wonders is when I look at histories of the Declaration of Human Rights in the West, be it France, be it the US, and the extent to which the centuries it took for those human rights declared as universal, etc., right, and yet deeply exclusionary on many counts, of course, property, as we know, but women. Why did it take, I would like an answer, why did it take 1.5 centuries in France for women to even get the right to vote? And it was an accident in 1944 at the time of World War II. So I say this not because I feel proud of India, but our context was a colonial context in the 19th century, a colonial context within which the question of women getting rights that men on the same terms as men was something that the Indian National Congress, for instance, the Muslim League, all the major parties of the late colonial moment of the late 19th, early 20th century, it didn't take them very long to say, yes, women would get the same rights as men. I mean, if I want to sort of show off, I will say in India, women got the same rights as men before they had it in Britain. Okay, so this is some of the funny ironies of our world, right? That we are this backward nation with these horrible practices, but nonetheless, politically, it was possible in a colonial context for this to happen. Another complexity which I think is very important to put on the table here is, because we've been hearing a lot about people's rights, collective rights, individual rights, and in the morning it sounded as though from most of the speakers that I could hear that the two seemed to be rather seamlessly working together, that the collective and the individual were rather sort of that it was an additive. The additive quality of the individual led to the collective, and in India this has been rather different. Again, born in the colonial context, we had community rights, usually marked by religion or by caste, and individual rights, often set in a relationship of tension, if not conflict. Okay, and I think this history, of course, bears itself out even in certain spaces today, such that we have a history of rights where individual and community rights are seen as intrinsically in tension with each other. So the right to propagate religion is seen as being in conflict with women's rights because it includes patriarchal practices, for instance, yes? And so this has been very, very central to the history of the women's question. In India, we've therefore had to tackle a complex terrain from the very beginning. The other one that I want to sort of put on the table quickly, because I think probably everybody in this room has heard about the Dehli gang rape case, yes? I mean, it was world news in 2012, so much so that violence and sexual violence has come to take center stage when it comes, and this is true as much within India today as it is true internationally, that you associate the wrongs and rights of women with sexual violation and rape. This has happened, and it's for, again, complex reasons that I have also not fully understood what happened. Why did that particular case burst upon the scene in the way it did? So the substance of my presentation here is about labor rights. So where then do labor rights find a space within this kind of scenario? And simply I want to say labor rights and questions of labor have been fundamentally marginalized in a situation where either questions of culture, you know, national culture, Hindu-Muslim relations, and so on the one hand, violence issues, sexual violence on the other, where these two take up considerable space, issues of labor have been marginalized, so much so that the very dire situation of labor in India is all but hidden, including to feminists, including to, you know, forget others. It's not been a major issue in our context. The fact that we have one of the lowest work participation rates in the world is, I think, relatively unknown. The only nation that's worse than us is Saudi Arabia, and nobody in the world wants to be compared to Saudi Arabia, right? So this is the situation. This has been, and not only is it low, but in these very decades of high growth, jobless growth, the rates of labor participation have either been stagnating or declining. So this has been one of the strange things, that because you have certain high visibility sectors like the BPOs or the media and so on, this is largely invisible and hidden. And this is the context then within which I want to sort of present to you this contrasting set of concerns. One, microcredit. Microcredit, and we have someone here from Bangladesh who I'm sure can fill you in much more than I can. Microcredit was something that came into its fullness with globalization in the 1990s, whereby women were specifically targeted. Women, poor women I should say, were the prime target of microcredit forms of different forms, some of them loan schemes, some of them schemes with local banks, some of them what are called self-help groups, or SHG for short. Right? Groups of poor women, 10 or 12, put together, who again are given small amounts of credit to start some kind of employment generation or asset building scheme. This took major inspiration from Bangladesh, where I think major part of its economy, in fact, women's economy has indeed been deeply affected, revolutionized perhaps by microcredit. And of course, the other major player is the World Bank, because the World Bank found microcredit to fit in very nicely with their ideas of what was wonderful about globalization and informalization and markets, because this was a way to make women part of these markets. Women were targeted particularly because they were seen as more efficient micro-entrepreneurs. This was the language of the market, yes. Entrepreneurs, much better than their men. Men were condemned to being violent, to being inefficient, to smoking or drinking away the money, and so on. Women could be relied upon to use the money safely, well, for the welfare of their children. And so we had new arguments about using, again, the logic of the market, efficiency arguments, not arguments about exploitation, efficiency arguments as to why women should be the prime targets for microcredit. And you can imagine the complicated conundrum this puts feminists into. Feminists have obviously been arguing about patriarchal conditions that keep women out of markets, but this was a kind of twisting, distorting of those arguments in this kind of context. So lots of criticisms of microcredit, how it added actually further burdens to poor women, how it promoted self-exploitation, a lot of destructiveness in terms of competitiveness amongst women. Women became loaners to other women, and so on, and you have a kind of very, very sometimes ugly situation developing, and almost never leading to a real move into sustainable livelihoods, at best keeping very poor households outside of dire poverty. And the point I really want to make here, as I made elsewhere, is that I find it very interesting that this kind of financialization predates the kind of financialization we're talking about in terms of the kind of financial crises, the banks, etc., etc. You're having experiments with financialization happening in third world countries on the backs of poor women in the 80s and 90s before financialization becomes a global crisis. So I find that very fascinating. Now I want to shift gears from this picture, this panacea, this solution for all problems for economic rights for women in countries like ours, to the struggle over a living wage for garment workers, which was a fantastic and is an ongoing, a fantastic movement, a campaign, an Asia-wide campaign, very rare to be seen these days. Very, very few economic campaigns are able to go beyond their local regions. Here was an Asia-wide campaign led by the Asia Floor Wages Alliance and the Permanent People's Tribunal, which I had the good fortune of being invited to be a part of as a jury member. We see what I find fascinating about this campaign is its capacity in these times, in these globalized times. It is able to try at least to embody and actually practice what would the actual enactment of fundamental human rights look like for workers. That is to say, the struggle here is garment workers I'll just change it to the next. So this is, I don't know how familiar people here are with the Garment Workers Campaign and the Campaign for a Living Wage. The main production centers, of course, China is considerably in the lead, but there are other countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Cambodia, amongst others, which accounts for about 80 to 90% of world production, much of which is globalized production for all of you. Basically, your H&M and Gap and whatever those products are being made and under hyper-exploitative conditions, almost sometimes, verging on forced labor, what we in India sometimes call bonded labor, minimum wages being flouted by various means, and where there are women workers, especially in South India, subjected to extreme forms of harassment, sometimes sexual, otherwise forms of extreme humiliation. Trade union activity is usually broken, criminal elements are brought in. I mean, there's a whole picture here, and I'm sure, I don't know if the report that was put out by the Asia Floor Wages Alliance is available online. You can actually read about it at great length. And one where the effort has been to make it genuinely global. That is to say, you want to look at conditions on the ground, but you also want to make those global manufacturers in some way accountable, the ones who are sitting in Sweden or Italy or the US or wherever they are. Now, we have a huge challenge in a country like India where a living wage is simply not a fundamental right. It does not exist in the form of a right in our constitution. It takes the form in our constitution of what is called a directive principle of state policy. Yet, I think those who are part of this campaign have been able to find ways to find a constitutional element by linking it to the right to life and dignity, which was, by the way, these were fundamental rights that were put in place by B.R. Ambedkar, that is our Dalit leader, who was also so-called the father of our constitution. So this is the one leg that we are hoping to pin a living wage onto, and the other, of course, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, with its notions which are extremely weak, I have to say, for an ILO, decent work and social protection. These are the terms of the ILO. I have to say we have to ask ourselves, what shape is the ILO taking in the 21st century? I would leave it as a question for all of you to ponder over. So these are basically, I want to stop here, these are the challenges before us. On the one hand, we see the translation of basic economic rights into the provisioning of microcredit as a universal panacea. So you have to imagine these little women's groups, producing pickles and what have you, as though that could somehow be a universal model for the future. And I'm even told that this universal model gets actually translated sometimes even into first world context. So it's a remarkable model. And on the other hand, we have an Asia-wide living wages campaign offering what I think has to be the future in thinking about rights in any context, which has to be counter-globalization. I do not see space for economic nationalism, if you ask me. It has to be a counter-globalization based on fundamental rights that speak to current realities. But the big question mark in terms of our thinking here is, while it may offer a model for a counter-globalization, how and in what ways can it challenge the financialization phase of global capitalism? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Grazie a Mary John.
Thank you.
Center for Women Development Studies.
Thank Mary John of this Center for Women's Studies in Delhi. I must say that I found this story and these graphs quite fascinating, because we heard the story, the situation of women that is reasonably well known, and I have been in contact with owing to my work in the past. But then new ideas on, for instance, on microcredit. There is a considerable amount of literature and widespread concepts on what is almost a myth, microcredit. My generation grew up thinking that that was the recipe for women in certain parts of the world. So it was very interesting for me to hear how you are thinking about it, and your story, your version of microcredit, and how you see it also as being at the root or expression of many situations of non-recognition or even denial of rights. So thank you. I thank Mary John for that interesting presentation. And now we have our last speaker, and I really would like to welcome our last speaker for having come and for her patience. But our next speaker is Mrinal Kanti Tripura. We're not sure we pronounced it properly. But is director of the Maleya Foundation from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country that we have read about recently for events, some stories that affected us very directly in these last few days, but a country that we know not very much about and have read very little about. And he's here with us now to talk about his work, and in particular his work with a minority in Bangladesh. He comes from a very small town, and if we're not mistaken, the people you work with are the Jumma people, indigenous group. But we'll give the floor to Mrinal Kanti Tripura. Mrinal Kanti Tripura. Mrinal Kanti Tripura. Mrinal Kanti.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I would like to thank the co-organizers for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to share with you all the situation of Chittagong Hill Tracts, where I come from. And I would like to thank my friend Fulvio for introducing me to this process. Otherwise, I would have been left behind. So thanks for that. And as we all know, I would like to express my great sorrow for the killing that happened in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, 2 days back. And I'm extremely sorry for that on behalf of Bangladeshi people, because I'm here in the country where in Bangladesh, 9 citizens of this country unfortunately have been killed. But anyway, we all have to deal with that situation. So now let me also express my observation and feelings listening to the speeches from various experienced people here this morning on the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Peoples that was adopted in 1976, 40 years before. That time I think I was either 10 or 12 years old. But today, when I see the context and when I see the articles written in the declaration, I still see the relevance. So we cannot say that much have been changed. So the basic things are still almost same. So with that, I would like to start my presentation here, and let me invite you to a short journey to Chittagong Hill Tracts, the place I come from. So I mainly talk about the Chittagong Hill Tracts, some brief background on that, and the accord we signed in 1997. I mean, the accord signed between the government of Bangladesh and the indigenous peoples of Chittagong Hill Tracts, which collectively known as Jumma people. And of course, the present status of the implementation of the accord and the issues and concerns of indigenous peoples. So as we know, this is Chittagong Hill Tracts, is the southeastern part of Bangladesh. It has border with Mizoram and Tripura of India and Myanmar. So it's a small country, but huge population. We have 160 million people. So, and the Chittagong Hill Tracts is 1/10 of the total area of Bangladesh. If we look at the history of Chittagong Hill Tracts, like how our rights, the indigenous peoples of Chittagong Hill Tracts has lost their rights gradually. Like it was annexed to the British in 1860, before it was independent, small independent kingdom, Sarawak kingdom. And so in 1874, it was declared by the British as scheduled district, and in 1900, enactment of Chittagong Hill Tracts regulation, and 1915 is declared as backward tract, and in 1935 declared as excluded area. So from 1860 to 1947 it was under British, and then 1947 India became independent, Pakistan became independent. So the Chittagong Hill Tracts people, although not Muslim by religion, we are part of Pakistan, the Muslim-dominated area, unfortunately. So if we look at the Pakistan period, it was still declared as excluded area. In 1962, declared as tribal area, and in 1964, it was abolished by status, any status. So in 1971, Bangladesh became independent, as we all know. So, and then formation of monolithic state based on Bengali nationalism. So this is how we lost our rights, and for that, in 75, we, the indigenous peoples of Chittagong Hill Tracts, started to reestablish our rights through raising armed struggle, and which ended in 1997 on 2nd of December through signing the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord. So these are the background, and if we look at the right the situation of food security, the Chittagong Hill Tract is one of the most food insecure areas in Bangladesh. So we have that map here. So this is the people of Chittagong Hill Tracts. And if we look at the demographic transformation in Chittagong Hill Tracts, like in 1872, 98% were indigenous, where 2% were non-indigenous, that is Bengali. So in 1901 is 93, and gradually, right now, in 2011, as per the census of Bangladesh, the indigenous population is 53%, and non-indigenous, that is Bengali, is 47%. And regarding the militarization in Chittagong Hill Tracts, is one of the most densely militarized region in the world. We can see it here. Like Chittagong Hill Tracts is 9% of the total area of Bangladesh, and population ratio is 1% and 99. And then ratio of army personnel is 33% and 67%. So civilian army for 1750, one army in Bangladesh in the plain areas, and in Chittagong Hill Tracts, 40 for one military for every 40 persons, including Bengalis. So this is one army camp. And if we look at the main issues in Chittagong Hill Tracts and the main demand of the indigenous populations in Chittagong Hill Tracts, we can see in two levels. One is at the structural level and the surface level. The structural level, we can see the state wants to control over political power in Chittagong Hill Tracts, control and domination. And on the other hand, the indigenous people's demand is freedom and self-determination. And the issues are like implementation of the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord, and market, land and resources, Islamization, militarization, and IP identity. So indigenous peoples, they want their own identity as people, and the government doesn't recognize. That's why we are not recognized even in the 15th Amendment of the Bangladesh Constitution, which was amended in 2011. Sorry. So these are the main issues and our demands and the government's position. So status of the implementation of the accord, if we look at, I would like to summarize it like the right to development, the right to land, the right to self-determination, and the right to self-governance, the right to economics, self-determination, all are stated in the accord, but it's not implemented, like the withdrawal of the military camps is not implemented, and the empowerment of the regional autonomy institution is not empowered properly, and the election is not held, and so the military is still controlling the civil administration in Chittagong Hill Tracts. So that's why we see the human rights violation, like indigenous people's rights are denied. Business people, powerful state and non-state actors are encouraged to grab the land of indigenous peoples using various means. Indigenous peoples are increasingly losing access to forest and natural resources on which their livelihoods depend, leaving many indigenous communities food scarcity, loss of cultural values and traditional food habit are common among the indigenous peoples communities due to deposition of land. And that's why we have the food scarcity. Recently, as every year, we have food scarcity in Chittagong Hill Tracts, but the problem is government doesn't allow any non-state actors to visit the place. And if we look at the recent human rights violations in Chittagong Hill Tracts, we can see the communal attacks on indigenous peoples, 27 attacks, and affected villages, 102, and houses burned, loot, damaged, 3,049, and persons killed, 3,980, and perpetrators are the Bengali settlers and the military. So year-wise violence against women, incidents in Chittagong Hill Tracts. In 2007 there was 9 violence against women, and in 2013 is 53, 2012 is 55, the highest. So is the context of the situation of Chittagong Hill Tracts in brief, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Grazie, ce l'abbiamo fatta con il PowerPoint. Thank you. We were able to set up the PowerPoint. Thank you, Mrinal Kanti, Tripura, for telling us a very classical story, we could say, of the violation of rights and fight for self-determination. Thank you for sharing your story. Also giving us figures that allow us to understand how the situation has developed in time. Now, we have the chance to take advantage of the speakers who are here now for some questions. So I would please ask you to put your hand up and ask any questions. I already see that there are people who want to ask questions, so please go ahead.
My question or comment goes to...
No, è meglio amplificare perché...
Is it better like that?
Perfetto.
Okay, my question or comment goes to Mary John. And first of all, I want to say thank you very much for this very good presentation. And I think it's no coincidence that the human rights talk has been instrumentalized by neoliberal elites and institutions such as the World Bank. Yeah, that's what they're doing. They're taking our emancipatory vocabulary in order to disguise their motives behind. Yeah? So it's all cool and nice, and it's always the talk about partnerships, about recognition. I mean, we all know that in every sphere which are relevant for human rights. And at the same time, I think it's no coincidence that we are not talking about labor rights, but the case of Indian women becomes scandalized as a problem of sexual violence. I just want to refer to Katria Spivak and her very prominent book, Who Speaks? Who speaks in which interest and for whom? And I think it is to defend racism, and it is also some kind of latent stereotyping, othering, and so on, to put the Indian woman into the role of a victim. And then, of course, there comes the international organization, helps that woman, giving her a microcredit, and so on. And I think this is really how the game goes. Yeah? Using the emancipatory words for doing bad things, and also to disguise the causes of poverty, which is, of course, power relations, and, of course, unfair economic conditions, and so on.
Solo una cosa prima che Mary risponda.
Only one thing before the answer. Could you please introduce yourself?
Nadja Meistans. I come from Germany, work there for university, and in Germany we also had this case where there was some sexual violence, and immediately this was abused by the right-wingers, pointing to refugees, saying, oh, see, they have a problem with women's rights, and again, it is to justify this kind of racist stereotyping.
Grazie. Prego.
Thank you. You can answer.
Thanks. Well, you did say most of it. At the same time, I think we should be a little careful of what one might call conspiracy theories. Let's not make it too grandiose and too simple. On the question of appropriation, I'm with you in the sense that we have absolutely seen an appropriation of a discourse on exploitation and exclusion of poor women, turning that into an argument for efficiency. That is a totally neoliberalized argument for why, and when we talk about it, everybody says, why are you getting so worked up? This is pragmatic. This is a way to make sure that corporates and the World Bank are going to give money and attention to poor women. So why are you getting worried that they're using it in their language and it's not your language? Okay, so this is what we are told. On the issue of violence, it's a little more complicated because this particular case, the so-called Dehli gang rape that happened in December 16th of 2012, it did happen. It created a public explosion in India. Okay, so it's not as though it only happened in the US or in Germany and then came back to no. It created a public outcry. You see, we in the women's movement are used to going on, campaigns when there is violence and so on. It's usually just 200, 300 women in Delhi or wherever, Bombay. This time there were tens of thousands of young people who had never been part of any political campaign ever. So we have to understand why and how that happened. What role did the Indian media play? What was it that the Indian middle class found in this particular case? It's a classic case of a good girl and slum men. So it's a perfect rape case, the most rare stranger rape case. Why did it then become a worldwide phenomenon? That's something all of you should answer. What is it about then worldwide media that it becomes such a major rallying point? It has also had good effects, meaning I think we have now been able to put in some perspective, at least in India, where is sexual violence, where is rape compared to domestic violence, compared to other forms of communal and other forms of violence. I think we've done some good research now on the subject. But it is absolutely true that it has made it much easier for the issues that I'm trying to raise, labor, women's work. These are not getting the space that they ought to be getting. These are remaining public secrets, if you like. And it's not sexy. Violence is sexy. Labor rights are boring. Nobody wants to hear about labor rights. So we have a much harder battle on our hands, even amongst ourselves, let alone public fora. And of course, you're right that there is, therefore, neoliberalism does not want us to question structures and power relations at that level. They're very happy to see slum men being put behind bars and movies made about such people compared to tackling the kinds of structural forms of, you could call those, I would call women's exclusion from labor a structural form of violence, but that's not the language of violence that people want to hear.
Allora, grazie a Mary per la risposta.
Thank you, Mary, for your answer. There is another question, one at a time. Always, could you please introduce yourself, even though you weren't one of the speakers from this morning, but please introduce yourself.
First, a question to Mary John, not concerning microcredits, which was fascinating, and your report was very, very interesting. I learned a lot, but I suspect that you can enlighten us on two recent dispute settlements. Before the World Trade Organization, in April, there was the Indian National Solar Mission, which was found not to benefit from the exceptions of the GATT 1994. And this was a matter in which the United States sued India, because India wanted to use local labor and locally made solar panels. One case pretty shocking, especially after COP21, because the intention was actually to move to renewable energy, and of course US manufacturers are making it more difficult. Number two, the rather shocking case of Vodafone against India. This is an investor-state dispute settlement arbitration Imagine that Vodafone doesn't pay taxes because it has its registered office somewhere in a tax haven. Now India is trying to tax it, and then because they're being taxed, they say, "Oh, I'm going to make less profit, therefore you pay me." I mean, it's a situation completely contra bonos mores, absurd. If you could enlighten us on those two.
No, I can't. I mean, there are so many levels. I mean, I think you've answered it yourself in a sense that the Indian government does play very strange games. On the one hand, and I don't know what to call the Indian government, you know, are we comprador at this point? As far as, I mean, we have a prime minister who has been to the United States in the space of 2 years 4 times. And the Indian media celebrates it. I think it's pathetic, you know, and the extent to which he keeps declaring how close and how much we are going to be working together, how much US policy is going to find its echo in India. I'm sorry, but it's scary to me. And most of the Indian middle classes thinks it's wonderful. And we have, of course, a very visible model minority of non-resident Indians in the US who also think it's wonderful. So in that context, what actually does the Indian state do in a GATT situation is anybody's guess. Sometimes you will see, therefore, that's what I'm saying. I haven't got my head around it. I haven't also given it the attention it ought to be given. That's not where my own work lies. But what we find is sometimes complete kowtowing to, either a large proportion of foreign capitalists in India pay absolutely no taxes, are given special tax breaks. Our corporate class also pays practically no taxes. So this is the default notion. But when pushed or shoved, suddenly we have a default economic nationalism that also kicks in. So we may sometimes decide that we must have locally produced, in this case maybe solar products. Whether or not those are the most efficient is I bow to that. I don't know enough about the technology to say. So our economic policies are very, very peculiarly politically decided, not based on any kind of consistent. I would say they're extremely inconsistent. But since I haven't given it my attention, I really wouldn't want you to quote me or anything of that sort.
Thank you. If I may ask one question of Mr. Tripura. Your story is hardly known outside of the Juma people. And what mechanisms, if any, as far as you know, have you engaged? For instance, when the report of Bangladesh before the Universal Periodic Review comes up in the Human Rights Council, I don't remember this ever being mentioned at the prior 2 UPR sessions. And there's also the possibility, of course, of flagging this to the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. You can also refer the matter to the working group on arbitrary detention. There are a whole series of mechanisms of the United Nations that could be useful, including the so-called Decolonization Committee. In my report concerning self-determination, I go into the 17 non-self-governing territories or occupied territories that are currently under scrutiny by the Committee of 24, otherwise known as the Decolonization Committee. But recently there was an additional country re-enlisted, which was French Polynesia, at the behest of Vanuatu. So it is possible to add countries to the agenda of the Decolonization Committee. And it would seem to me that your case is meritorious, that your case should be before the Decolonization Committee. And I don't know who in your Chitong Hill tracts would have the guts to bring it before the Decolonization Committee. It seems to me that your situation is dealt with in the Declaration of Algiers, and it would entail violations of multiple articles, but certainly of Article 4 and also of Article 15. Every people has the right not to have an alien culture imposed upon it. So, I mean, your right to maintain your identity is an important right that needs defense, and I would like to know what, if any, measures have been taken. Otherwise, you can write me and I can advise you what to do. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, we are engaged in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and one among the 16 members of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is from Bangladesh right now. I think you have heard his name, Devashish Roy. And so the issues is there. And also we have attended the UPR in the previous 2 sessions, in 2009 and after 4 years in 2013. So next is in 2018. So we are there. But the thing is, government doesn't, promise, or there are recommendations by other states, but the problem is it's not been implemented. And we are also in touch with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She's Vicky Tauli-Corpus. So she is very familiar with the situation of Chittagong Hill tracts. So it's there, but now the thing is, at the national level, how much is effective? Whatever we have in the international level, the good laws or policies and very good recommendations, but the challenge is implementation at the national level. So this, but anyway, I think it's important, the avenues that we haven't tried yet, that we could, I think, try in future, the avenues that you have just mentioned. Thank you.
If you send a communication to because we can do joint communications and we can also do joint follow-up. Thanks.
Bene, la comunicazione.
Good. So you can deal with that later. There is a question here and then somebody else there. So could you kindly introduce yourself before asking your question? So can you put on the mic, please?
Everybody, thanks for a wonderful panel. It's the kind of panel maybe where we need a whole evening to actually give responses. Not only coming from Ireland, I very much identify with the dilemmas which were put in the case of Colombia at this moment. It will still be a long struggle, but very interesting the way in which you have articulated those. And also on the question of memory, and this is the people's instrument actually to articulate the connectivity between their past and current struggles, and I think this is very much appreciated in your contribution. But I just wanted to make my comment in linking the connection with what Mary John said about labour today, and what our speaker from Paleologo, Mr. Paleologo, on migration. I think it would be interesting to have your comments on this. I believe that in our analysis of globalization, that one of the big missing gaps actually is the question that the globalization model, the economic and political model, requires major global labor without rights. That is the formula. And I believe we have to unpack that very strongly in going forward on the new challenges on migration. So I would like to know your ideas and opinion on that. Thank you.
Che funzioni, sì. Io in effetti sono molto contento di questa occasione.
I'm very happy to have this opportunity today, because as I will also to further follow up my research work with the PhD students of the University of Palermo, we're going to sort of further enlarge the scope of our research from migration to economic relationships at EU level and at international level as well. Well, the purpose we have in mind is to ensure that there is a more fairer allocation of resources and jobs. There's a further goal that should be pursued, as we cannot sort of think of retaining the same levels of growth that at the level that we have had till 2008. In Europe and in our own countries, we should try and look for new avenues, but we need the political interlocutors. We're not there at the time, so we will have to think in terms of redistributing wealth, reallocate resources, which would not result into decline of growth, but it will be a new social pact to have a level which is a decent level of living without increasing the inequalities between the richest and the poorest. So we should be capable of sort of looking at the problems of migration and migrants and how they fit in the labor market in Europe and European market, and the kind of relationships. I don't quite see how the trade unions are going to be acting on that. Neither do I see political leaders who are sort of courageous enough to take this matter into their hand, because they are sort of wanting to get electoral success on these issues of migration, etc. So we'll talk about other issues tomorrow, and unfortunately I won't be with you tomorrow, but certainly the way in which these issues are covered by the media is of the essence to try and sort of introduce some critical thinking on this issue, rather than sort of doing what the European Union does to strengthen the control at the borders and agreements with transit countries to combat more effectively illegal migration. That's the state of play of the debate in Europe today. Whilst we should be capable of raising a different type of issue on the basis of a new paradigm, labor mobility, and how this does fit in with the migrant question. Well, there's something which is extremely important in that in Italy is economic migrants that come to Italy. And we have sort of not taken this matter into consideration, because we basically set specific quotas for the number of economic migrants that could only spend that amount of time in Italy. At the EU level, there was a major sort of opportunity in Tampere, decided in Tampere in 2009, sorry, and then this was set aside. Then there was a possibility of opening up new opportunities of people to come in if they had a job. But this has been put aside because of the attacks in Paris and Brussels and because of the referendum in the UK. Then, of course, we have to establish the relationship between economic migration and the economy. This would enable us to come up with an alternative approach. There are two requests for the floor.
Commento
I'd like to ask Javier Giraldo to elaborate on one point. His example on Colombia and the feasibility of implementing transitional justice was a further example of what was emphasized this morning by Ferraioli. The danger we have today is to sort of emphasize the point about justice and right in line with some rules, which at the end of the day is a sort of a cosmetic approach, because the model which is not being brought into question is that of presence of economic multinational corporations, which demands that we sort of preserve the very structure which has given rise to war in the last few years. So I'd like to ask him to elaborate on this. And also, I'd like to ask him to tell us how you have experienced this huge historic process which took place in Colombia with the presence or the absence of the so-called international community, which may have been somewhat conniving with what was happening. So it was something which was taking place at a local level, but all these special relationships with Colombia, which had been emphasized by the Tribunal on Colombia, have not been changed. Quite to the contrary, it was confirmed that the position of the European Union and the US was a right position to retain that level, which is compatible with a transition process which doesn't involve the communities. There was a further question for Carlos Beristain. The question is the following. In your experience, to what extent can we sort of think in terms of creating doctrine? You've had relationship with the Inter-American Court. To what extent this is something which can be put into practice when you look for witnesses which would give evidence that can be used in courts, because that is definitely going to change our search for witnesses and the way in which we hand down our judgment. Who's going to speak first?
Prego.
Well, I'll answer briefly. I would say that the interests of the international community, starting with the United States, the interests they have in the peace process in Colombia can be quite easily identified. You just have to look at the visits of President Santos to other countries, his discussions with business leaders, with governments. The idea of peace that they are spreading is a peace that will enable foreign investment in Colombia, and in particular the investment of multinational corporations in Colombia. I believe that the interests of the entrepreneurial leaders and some governments, with very few exceptions, really consists in the attractiveness of investing in Colombia, in extraction of natural resources, and one of the most important sectors in the economy now is mining. Now, I would say that the weakness of the peace dialogues in the entire process is really the fact that the items on the agenda that were related to the economic and political models were really the first two: land and political participation. These were items that were discussed very little. The government rejected all of the proposals that came from the FARC, our group, but they were at the same time the proposals of the social movements of Colombia, and they had been developed and put forward by fora that had been organized throughout Colombia. And the request was to slow down the concentration of land ownership. And from the 80s onwards, 8 million people have been evicted from their land. And of course, their life at that point became the life of a displaced person, having been violently evicted from land, from a similar number, let's say, of hectares of land. And the proposals, therefore, to curb this concentration of land ownership met with full front opposition from the government. What the government wanted was to convert the expropriation of land into a sort of market mechanism, sharing out the title deeds that could be sold to businesses, whereas the guerrillas and the people's movements were trying to have a large area of reserve for the campesinos set aside, that is land that could not be bought and sold in the market, but which would have a status that would be similar to that of the indigenous people's reserves, land therefore that cannot be bought or sold, but land that would help to slow down this concentration of land rights and land ownership in the hands of a very few. The government rejected all of the proposals. The only point they did accept was to set up some amount of land, the exact amount was never defined, to be shared among the landless. But the idea was always to do so on the basis of marketable land deeds. We believe, in the light of the tradition of corruption, of cronyism, that has been so much a feature of Colombian politics in the past, we are quite sure that these land titles will be used. Votes will be bought, there will be an exchange of votes for land deeds, and it will enter all these mechanisms. And therefore, the solutions that were envisaged for the first two items of the agenda, and something very similar was discussed and devised in the case of political participation. All of this does not do anything to weaken, quite the opposite. It strengthens this model of consolidation of power. All of this has generated distrust, and the impact of this land policy. And there was a group inside the negotiation, which was the historical group of the conflict. I was a member of that group, and the first question that was addressed to the members of the group was, what is the root cause of the conflict? And there was virtually unanimous agreement that the root cause was land ownership and the concentration of land ownership in the hands of very, very few. So the solution to the conflict has not taken into account the social roots of the conflict that were the cause of the conflict in the first place. So there's been a sort of ceasefire arrangement that will represent a temporary solution, but the roots are there, the roots are alive, and very soon the conflict could start all over again. That is my analysis. Thank you. Carlos? Thank you. I think there are different ways of addressing this. The narration of the victims is often seen as a sort of minor narrative. And I think we're lacking the methodologies and the approaches which would help us convert these victims' narratives into an evidence, not extracting it from the context, but when we hear, for instance, 1,000 women in Colombia, and we have 1,000 witnesses, and we have a standardized method, and we can compare and we can seek evidence, then we have really evidence on the role of women in the conflict, the impact that no one else has, and this can be very important in building documents. This document was discussed in Havana and can be part of the Truth Committee. There are other different ways in which we can work. There's the juridical framework too. We can look at the evolution of concepts and how, starting with an impact evaluation, in the case of the desaparecidos, for instance, 24 people who disappeared. It was discussed in Colombia, and there was a discussion on whether the denial that the state had made of this case of the desaparecidos was a violation of the right to information or of the physical protection of the victims of the. So we can work carefully to bring facts that would be ignored into a more formal expression and make sure that they're present in the dialogue. So we can generate a second level information that can be listened to, that will be more easily listened to. If you look at, for instance, the impact of oil pollution linked to the oil industry, and then, of course, the engineering companies will be looking at the micrograms of cadmium in the water, whatever, but not the broader context of what is happening in terms of schooling and the communities, the loss of the indigenous people's land, changes on the diet, the fear-generating environment, all of these things that are factors that are simply ignored, that are not visible. They can be found in people's accounts and people's stories, but we have to bring that into something that will be listened to and give them the quote-unquote status that can then help these anecdotes claim reparation. We can look at the different principles, but we know that there will be redress if it is brought in the case made for the victims, and something real, not simply something that will be meaningless. So the narration of testimony and the meaning that it has for the victim has to be at the center of our discussion on what redress and reparation means. We cannot have a tribunal determining that what will be redressing by decree, and that there will be these measures. This can only emerge from a discussion and from linkage with the people. But this is it's not a matter of being good-hearted people and doing things nicely. We have to bring these stories to the levels, to the fore, where they are to be discussed in a way in which they can be discussed, and there are tools for that. Thank you, Carlos. 2 questions here, and then we have one over there. I had seen a hand raised there. It's back up again. Good. Right, so we'll take these 3 questions. We have enough time for these 3 questions. So please go ahead. The mic is live.
It is a little bit too late. My name is Fulvio Valenti. I'm from Brazil. This panel messed around with me in several levels. Personal level, relationship level, and professional level. You know, I see myself in the whole panel. And I think, I thank Carlos a lot. Because, I know what the testimony means for the victim. As a victim of one myself a long time ago, I never had this process. And I know what it meant to me, not being able to live it, to live the process of doing it. Because I was exiled and all that, and when I came back, was not in the fashion anymore. Then we go into the struggle, and then we go and go and go, and now, 50 years or 40 years after, especially with the conditions of the country going through now, where people are calling for the dictatorship back, I'm putting out everything that I didn't. And I'm doing this by sharing my poems that I wrote during the time of the dictatorship. So it's something that I never thought of doing, and now I'm doing. So I'm just sharing something that I think for me was very important. At the other thing, at the other level, I think that the question of how do we get out of this bind that we are in right now? You see, I think, as peoples of the world, us, all of us together, Europeans, I was a migrant my family migrated from Europe to Brazil, and then I came back from Brazil to Europe in a migrating fashion as well. So that's how do we tackle this horrible situation we are in? And that's where my professional thing comes in. We've been working in FIAN International, together with a lot of other people, on what we are calling convergence, a convergence process. How do we converge the struggles of the peoples, from bottom up, but also horizontally, at the local, at the national, and at the global level? How do we force governments to sit with us to discuss our agenda and not their agenda? Not to discuss the migrants in Greece, but migrants. Let's discuss migrant issue. Where are the causes, and how do we deal with the causes, and not with the specific situation of the 10 or 20 or 30,000 that are dying at the beach there? But how do we tackle the whole thing? And I think if we don't manage to do this, to reverse the thing, and to make them sit and talk to us as one agenda, and not the way they do now, where they say, oh no, this is discussed in the WTO, oh no, this is discussed in the UNICEF, this is discussed in the UN Human Rights Council or something. And I would like to ask you, how do you think that we can link the struggles? We were in India visiting the tea gardens this last December, and we saw the horrible situation in West Bengal that they are living in, all these closed gardens and all that stuff. And we are working together with Mrinal. So I think, in a certain way, I would like to know, how do we tie together this work? How do we tie ourselves together in a new front? And I think somebody said today, I think it was the president of the tribunal, he said, that we, for the first time, are victims as humankind. How in the hell do we organize ourselves as humankind? How are we going to become internationalists, really? Or not? Because this is the big thing. I grew up in my political career hearing about internationalism from my Trotskyite friends, from all the versions of socialism at the time, but nobody wanted to talk to each other. Are we ready to talk to each other right now? How do we do it? I think this is the question. How do we use your knowledge to build this unity? That's my question for us.
Grazie, Flavio Valente. Grazie.
Thank you, Antonio Valente. Thank you for your comments and for asking a number of questions. I don't think we can answer here and now in a few minutes. We have very little time for the last question from up there. Then I'll ask whoever is going to take up the question to be very short.
I enjoyed the morning. It was wonderful, but I do have a problem because the International Criminal Court was constantly mentioned as an example of justice, whereas I think it is a very clear example of the criminalization of justice. And I think someone pointed out this morning that Europe, we are the bad guys when it comes to trade relations. My question is, if we are the bad guys when it comes to trade relationships, then how can we, is it not wishful thinking to suddenly imagine that we have a just justice system? And another question, as far as Bangladesh and microcredit is concerned, I traveled for 2 months in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in 2004, and I saw wonderful examples of microcredit which actually did empower women, and the whole philosophy of where it came from. I don't think Mohammed Yunus got any help from the World Bank for many, many years. So I did see some very positive examples, and I wanted to hear from the person from Bangladesh.
Grazie, allora prego. Ecco.
Yeah, I have experience on microcredit. It depends on the locality. Like some who have that opportunities to utilize that money properly, they can develop their financial condition. But in our case, it's really worse in Chittagong Hill Tracts, because I don't know how to say, the time for returning money, the rate of interest, all these things doesn't favor the livelihood in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So I won't say that microcredit brought positive changes in our case. Maybe in the plain areas they have a lot of opportunities to invest the money and to gain, and then return. So that's different thing. But in our case, it's not.
I think the point is not to say there can be no good cases. I don't think if you heard me saying that, you misheard me. I think we're talking about the way in which something can be appropriated. Mohammed Yunus was appropriated by the World Bank. Yes, it was subsequently. What he did was appropriated, and finally he was unfortunately also vilified. So I'm not saying that there couldn't be some area. There are many areas in India where indeed women, and I don't know what the word empowerment means, please explain it to me. It could mean that some women somewhere are doing somewhat better than they were doing before, but we have no real examples of what it ought to mean, which is a full-fledged living wage, living in security, moving out of poverty, not knowing poverty again, having an alternate future for your children. Surely economic rights must translate into that. Microcredit is not doing any of that. Okay, so I'm talking at a macro level. I'm not talking about individual cases which may or may not luck out and do something somewhere. But the idea that you could build actually that large-scale poverty could be sorted out by having women's little groups making pickles and making, some savory goods and making some jam somewhere, that is the model. That is the model that is being pushed by the state, by international donors. I think that is a problem.
Grazie.
Thank you so much, Mary John. We've run out of time, so I think that you'll have plenty of food for thought tonight, as you'll have to think about the possibilities of implementing the Charter and the article of the Charter which has been shown by Nicoletta, and a possible agenda to update the work of the tribunal and the work of the Charter. We will not stop at that, because tomorrow we shall meet again at 9:30 at the Lumsa. There won't be any problem in terms of dress code there, because at 9:30 tomorrow there will be the final session. And I've been asked to just express our thanks to the interpreters that have helped us with the translation. I'd like to thank all the speakers of this afternoon and the participants.
Thank you.